Most of us come to Napoleon through a legend, right? We get to Napoleon through a Napoleonic legend that is, we will discuss hopefully on this podcast, of his own creation, which makes him quite unique from other historical figures. I mean, Alexander died too young. Caesar got killed unexpectedly for himself, right? Many others simply didn't have the capacity or time to craft an epitaph for themselves. Napoleon did. And that's the 6 years that he spends in exile allows him to craft a vision of himself, a very successful, very endearing vision of himself, very alluring. And that's what we encounter.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to my podcast, Discourses of Our Time. Our guest today is Dr. Alexander Mikaberidze, a professor of history and the Ruth Herring Noel Endowed Chair at Louisiana State University. Dr. Mikaberidze is one of the leading experts of Napoleonic Wars and generally of Napoleonic era, not only in the United States, but also worldwide. He wrote or edited 2 dozen books, including the widely acclaimed book, The Napoleonic Wars, A Global History, which was published by the Oxford University Press in 2020. He is a 2020 winner of Gilles de Lerman Book Award and also the 2020 winner for the Distinguished Book Award by the Society for Military History. Welcome, Dr. Mikaberidze. It's an honor to have you on my podcast.
Thank
I
you
would
so
say,
much.
Sure, absolutely. You studied, taught, and wrote about Napoleon more than any human being I ever met, and I think that would be the case for a lot of people around me. Considering the public's everlasting interest in Napoleon, I hope to delve a bit deeper into Napoleon's phenomenon today. Generations of leaders, politicians, historians, wannabe greats, historians, and just ordinary people, including myself, have been and are still mesmerized by Napoleon, by Napoleon's phenomenon. And we know there is a lot of statistical evidence, the medical evidence, that many people actually literally lost their mental sanity in their pursuit to somehow replicate and imitate Napoleon. There are a lot of cases of this. Why Napoleon is so mesmerizing? What makes Napoleon so mesmerizing? And I fully realize that he truly achieved some astonishing feats. He rose from a relatively humble background. He reached the pinnacle of power, and he accomplished the things which very few individuals accomplished. But we also have other historic figures who achieved no less, beginning from Alexander the Great, the Caesar, Charlemagne, and on and on. But none of these historic figures or any other historic figure really generated so much religious-like adoration. Why Napoleon? What is so exclusive, so special about Napoleon?
Thank you. That's a very, I think, complex question, and a question that is multifaceted in how we can address it, really. I think one way we can deal with it is by asking why Napoleon remains such a potent force in our imagination, because I think much of what you've alluded to is the historical memory, the imagination as it survives. And I always tell my students that most of us come to Napoleon through a legend, right? We get to Napoleon through a Napoleonic legend that is, we will discuss hopefully on this podcast, of his own creation, which makes him quite unique from other historical figures. I mean, Alexander died too young. Caesar got killed unexpectedly for himself, right? Many others simply didn't have the capacity or time to craft an epitaph for themselves. Napoleon did. And that's the 6 years that he spends in exile allows him to craft a vision of himself, a very successful, very endearing vision of himself, very alluring. And that's what we encounter, because I often compare him to, at least the vision, the popular image of Napoleon, to a siren. It is like a siren luring Odysseus and his comrades. Napoleon is irresistible when you are young, when you're maybe in that the teenage angst, and you see this self-made man who rose from, you can say, nothing to the pinnacle of the power. That's very enticing. And then once you get to know him, you realize that he is probably among the most well-rounded, among the most capable human beings who ever existed. So that's also very interesting to study. A man who is at the center of empire that stretches from the shores of Portugal to the Niemen River on the border of Russia, from Denmark to the tip of Italy, and he rules it single-handedly. I mean, it's stunning to contemplate his ability to multitask, and not just multitask, but also micromanage. And so that also is alluring. What is important, however, and I think this is where we oftentimes fail, is to go beyond the legend. And usually it's, and then that's maybe we can get to discuss the issue of how history is taught, right? And because oftentimes what happens is that that image becomes so ingrained, this Napoleonic legend becomes so ingrained in our memories that by the time we're kind of done with history, so to speak, right? And most people, once they are finished high school or first couple of maybe college courses, that's it. That's the extent of history they really want to do. They don't look beyond the legend. They don't scratch the surface to contemplate the complex problem that Napoleon is as a historical individual, because his legacy is very complicated. It has some good things, some bad things, and some really ugly things. But in popular imagination, that ugly and bad oftentimes is overshadowed by the good that the legend creates.
Okay, so in a lot of respects, Napoleon was able to sculpt his own image.
Absolutely. I mean, how many historical individuals you know who sat down and wrote more than half a dozen volumes of their memories, right?
Yeah.
Memories that are very calculated in their intent.
Maybe
If you,
Caesar.
if
Caesar, maybe, yeah.
yeah, well, it's a one small slim volume though. I would have
Okay.
gone maybe with Bismarck, whose
Yeah,
memoirs are very interesting.
yeah,
Churchill certainly had
sure,
a bit, I think comes close to in terms of
sure.
recasting himself, but he spent most of his writing, especially post his retirement, in terms of kind of writing history, rather than necessarily kind of reinventing himself. But Napoleon did, and he recast himself as a Prometheus. Right?
Right.
If you read his writings from St. Helena, you'll see that he cast himself as a martyr who's been chained to this faraway island in the middle of nowhere because he wanted good things for people, but he was just ahead of time and people misunderstood him. And here you have this giant who is brought down by the pygmies, right?
Yeah,
And cast aside to this rock. And that is, in the context of things in the 19th century, it makes him a very appealing figure. And there is I mean, the 100 Days, right? 1815, when Napoleon escapes from Elba and comes
right.
back, such a romantic kind of historical event. And Victor Hugo has a wonderful saying that never before in history was an empire won by a man simply showing his head. Right? how
Right,
many how
right,
many examples can you
right.
come up with like that?
Well, it's also interesting that yes, the one thing is that he wrote all of this about himself. He sculpted his own image, but another thing is that society actually bought it. I mean, we can write whatever we want, but the readiness of the society to accept the Napoleonic myth is quite telling also about him.
Absolutely, and that is because Napoleon was skillful enough to understand that in order for the legend, for the image that he was crafting to be possible, to be acceptable, it needs to have a kernels of truth. So we know that Napoleon's legacy in art, in cinema, in literature, in interior, it's all kind of this legend, right? It's a popular imagination, but they're based on tangible accomplishments that he's done. Few outside maybe France, right, or few outside academia remember the fact that much of modern France, and I would say many of the institutions around Europe, are based on the reforms that he introduced. Certainly, that's absolutely true for France. You choose any aspects of modern day French civil, political, educational system, and all of them will be tracked back to something that Napoleon did. From Bank of France, which Napoleon established in 1800, to municipal administrative reforms that still underpin how France is governed today. Those are reforms introduced in 1800, 1801. National archives, public treasury, national vaccination programs. Speaking of COVID and vaccination, right? Challenges that we faced. Well, Napoleon was first modern proponent of
Sure.
vaccinational program is him. Civil servants pension systems is all him. Not to mention the lycée system, or the chambers of commerce, or the labor courts, or the notorious bac, which every high school student in France has to pass in order to graduate. Not to mention Paris Stock Exchange, Bar Association, fire brigades. Napoleon is all of this. So when we talk about Napoleon's image, it's not wars that necessarily make up his legacy. That is a separate issue. But the what Napoleon famously says are the sculptures of granite, the granite blocks. These are the reforms that he set in place and upon which this legend is built.
Okay. If we can speculate what it would be like for an ordinary person to meet Napoleon personally. Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, his famous, or maybe I should say actually his infamous foreign minister, once said that being with Napoleon was like standing next to the bomb which was about to go off, by which he was pretty much referring to his immense charisma and enigmatic power. But not everybody saw Napoleon in that light. We know that he was not only despised, but many people actually saw him as very unsavory character. Many saw him as very vulgar, even so. So, what it would be like to meet him?
Yeah.
It's quite interesting thing, I would say.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I would love. Actually, here I have a student. I don't know if video feed is recorded, but I have a cutout of Napoleon that students gave me. So it's a life-size cutout. So he's looking over my shoulder. So you can say that I hang out with him every day. This reminds me of one of Napoleon's close friends, or associates. Let me put it this way. Responded in a letter, and he says, to his own friend, he says, "You ask me what is General Bonaparte." This is in early 1800. This letter is written. So he says, "You ask me what is this General Bonaparte? To know him, one has to become him." So one of the things that made Napoleon unique is that he had a very complex character, a lot of angles to it. And Napoleon himself foresaw this complexity, this uncertainty of who he really was, and he commented on multiple occasions that, and I think one of the quotes that comes to my mind, that he found, he says, "I found it very difficult to assert with any degree of truth what was my whole and real intention." Of course, that's something that he says at the end of his career. But if you read, I think the best insight we have into him, his character, his mindset, is his epistolary legacy, his letters, his writings. I was fortunate enough to be a small part, but still part of a recent effort by the French historians to publish his letters, what he's written, and we've collected over many years over 40,000 letters that were published in this 15-volume set. And that's an update on the older correspondence publication that was done during the Second Empire. And so and if you read these letters, what he wrote, like I've done, and then I've gone through this almost entirety of his writing, you'll be rewarded with an insight of, I think, of who he was as a man, or as a politician, as a statesman. And I think one of the things that will strike you is that, to his remarkable strength of mind, to his power of concentration, there was no subject, no matter how seemingly complex, arduous, or remote, there was no subject that he could not learn or conquer. If Napoleon found it useful to learn, Mandarin or Sanskrit, or if he wanted to tightrope walking or whatever it was, he would put himself to it and master it. So I think that's one of the important character traits to him that makes him both a potent force to deal with, and why we refer to this entire period after him. when we consider that virtually everything that Napoleon knew, he picked up as he went along. Right? He received, by modern standards, he received a basic education. He went to military school. I would say, in terms of a higher education, he only was at the Paris Military Academy for about 1.5 years. That's all. The rest of what he knew is what he learned himself. He was, in many respects, an autodidact. And if you think that he was a lifelong learner, and there's a fascinating study that a friend of mine just published on Napoleon's library. It is just stunning to see the breadth of his interests. Right? Then you cannot but be awestruck, but because you are witnessing a true dynamo. And one of his companions, he famously says, Napoleon knows everything, he does everything, he can do anything, because they are struck by him. In 1816, when he's on St. Helena Island, he has this ability to, he has this time, he has spare time to contemplate. And he famously says this, that work is my element. Right? And he says, I'm built for work. I have known limitations of my hands, my feet. I have known the limitations of my eyes, kind of physical limitations. But he says, I've never been able to know the limitations of my working capacity. And that is another character trait that he has. He's famously workaholic. Right? The stories of him working 14, 15, 16 hours a day, him taking a quick nap here and there and be refreshed and being able to work, or the famous story of him waking up officials at the ministries or his secretaries of state and saying, hey, people of France are paying your salary, you better earn it, right? And he would do this like at 2 o'clock in the morning. He'll walk around, wake up, we got stuff to do. I think this is a remarkable side to him. Another kind of interesting element to him is that he's curious by nature. He reads voraciously. He studied all his life, and that allowed him to be a personality that contemporaries describe in this words that border kind of lawdery. He had a magnetic personality, because people were drawn to that wit. He was quite funny. He was an intellectual, and so I think there was a lot to him that made him an appealing figure. Now let me flip that and point out that alongside all of this, he was quite narcissistic. He was quite vain, quite ambitious, quite ruthless. The same letters show his callous disregard for human life, his ability to, for example, impose collective punishments when it suited him on entire villages, if not cities, because he wanted to make example of it. And anyone who studied the 1796 campaign knows what he did at Pavia or what he did in later years in Spain. But in many respects, he was, I would say, first truly modern politician. And so in my own works, I point out his role in, for example, setting up a police state. Yes, it may not be the police state of the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, but in the concept, in its approach to population control, public opinion management, Napoleon is way ahead of his time. So that's another kind of aspect to him. What else can we say? He's brilliant military commander, right? Yes, we can talk about his later setbacks, but and there are reasons for those setbacks. But if you look at the first, I think, 15 years of his career, they're simply stunning. And there is the reason why, for example, his campaign of 1805 is still taught at West Point Military Academy in the United States, because it still offers a classic, what is now considered a classical example, right, of that decisive battle that shapes the 19th century warfare.
Right. I don't think that there are many people who can deny Napoleon's genius. He was a genius. There is no question about that. But do you think that his genius was a little bit exaggerated by history and historians? Because when you track his career, he made some staggering errors of the judgment. And there were quite a bit. The disastrous military campaign in Egypt, then incursion into Palestine and Syria, then invasion of Spain, so-called Iberian Ulcer, the Peninsula War, which claimed the lives of thousands and thousands of French soldiers without much results to show. And finally, this disastrous, cataclysmic military campaign in Russia, which eventually became his undoing. And generally, his military genius also somehow kind of started to fade away in the later years. His tactical brilliance was replaced with more conventional sledgehammer-like attacks with massive casualties among his soldiers without much results again. And the list is pretty long. So was his genius a little bit exaggerated?
I would say yes. I think the answer would be kind of yes or no. In that, I think the, in many respects, it goes down to the type of historical literature we consume. So if we look at Napoleon's treatment or in his image in popular history, then yes, he kind of is a giant that dominates and kind of strides along and crushes everyone until hubris kind of gets the best of him. But I think in an academic scholarship, he's been treated for quite some time in a very different manner. We can go all the way to kind of late 19th century French school, where the historians were already pointing out, like Taine and Laffrey and others, the big problems that Napoleon left behind. And of course, later on, I mean, Peter Gale, the great Dutch historian, wrote a fascinating study on Napoleon for and against, in which he kind of lays out the complexity of Napoleon's legacy, but also the historical debates about it. And then, of course, more recently, for example, you have critical studies of Napoleon by Philip Dwyer. He wrote 3 massive volumes on kind of recasting Napoleon through a critical side. Michael Broers is quite kind of balanced in his treatment. And I would say in my own work was done in order to kind of point out a couple of things. One is that Napoleon did not accomplish all of these things single-handedly, right? He's not a Superman. He's not a super kind of ubermensch that can do everything himself. What we oftentimes forget is that he's surrounded by a group of very capable men, a group that makes these things possible, right? He's at the center of a system that effectively creates an empire and then sustains the empire and ultimately, in many respects, outlives this empire as well. So one of my projects that I'm working on is looking at what I call it Napoleon's men, right? The ministers, for example, that are so absolutely powerful in the system and who are crucial to understanding Napoleon's reforms and Napoleon's legacy. I think in military affairs, yes, the first 15 years of his career, he's absolutely brilliant, unstoppable. Yeah. But then I think around 1807, 1808, the success gets the best of him. And I think his self-confidence after 1807 borders delusional. And I think hubris comes into play. And if that to me at least that's clear in reading his writings. I mean, he still is capable of moments of utter brilliance. Whether in spring of 1813 or especially in the winter of 1814, he's absolutely stunning. I think he's clearly at a kind of on the decline. And what I find fascinating is in one of his letters he does know that. I mean, back in 1806, he writes a letter in which he says, "I cannot sustain this pace, right? Being at the center of everything and managing all the empire, the army, all of this." He says, "I cannot sustain this for more than 5-6 years at best." So it's interesting that he says it in 1806 because by 1812 we clearly see him struggling. One of his advisors, fascinating guy, less known unfortunately, but is Molé. And Molé has a wonderful quote in one of his in his memoirs, in which he says, "Napoleon's common sense amounted to genius." So he's like, "Yes, this guy is genius." And yet, he says, somehow he never quite knew where the possible led off. And I love that quote because, on one hand, he acknowledges what this man was, but yet he also points out that oftentimes he lost the touch of what is possible and what is not. And I think that was a crucial reason in the downfall of the empire that he built.
Right. But somehow it's kind of a paradox that Napoleon almost always managed to got away with these astounding blunders. And as you also mentioned, and we know this from history, he was a master propagandist to spin the narrative to his own favor. Was this the only reason why he managed to get away from this? Like, for instance, leaving the troops in Egypt, after which he takes power in France. Probably it would be a very logical conclusion for a lot of leaders to be arrested, or at least his career to be over, but not for Napoleon. And there are many other examples there when he repeatedly managed to get away with these astounding, really, really deep blunders. How?
I think let me kind of address the first half and the second half of it. One For the first half of his career, I think one key reason why he was able to get away with all of this is that he's successful. He gets away with a lot in Italy in 1796. He, in many respects, defies the direct orders of government. He without permission, engages in diplomatic negotiation with an enemy and ultimately leads and concludes the peace on the terms that he imposed rather than listen to the government, because he is the general who wins the war. So that's one aspect of it. Kind of, he's successful. And the second, I think, that's kind of for the early career is that the wider context, historical context in which he's operating. When he began his career, he found the world in chaos, in this revolutionary convulsion. The old way of life, the ancien regime, that as we refer to it today, was collapsing. And yet the new order, the new regime, had yet to materialize. And so Napoleon, therefore, fills this important gap in between the old and the new way, this transitional stage. There is a wonderful French historian, Louis Bergeron, who famously says that Napoleon was both behind and ahead of his time, that he was the last of enlightened despots and the prophet of modern state. And that ability for him to be both revolutionary and counter-revolutionary is very, very important to understand why he was able to get away with a lot of things. His ability to consolidate revolution, right, to create Napoleonic code that gave people some of the things that they wanted, while at the same time restoring a monarchical system that many French didn't want to, also is, again, part of that. He was so that's, I think, the first half of it, kind of his reforms, his military success, all that allowed him. I think in the second half of it, again, historical circumstances are helpful, because one of the ways we can explain his success in wars of the third, fourth, fifth coalitions is that until 1813, he never really faced a united Europe. Yes, coalitions were created, but those coalitions acted disjointly. They rarely were able to put all their resources, not to mention armies, in place at the same time. I mean, look at 1805, right? My last book deals with the biography of Russian Field Marshal Kutuzov, who commanded the combined Russian-Austrian armies, and we know what happened to them. Napoleon destroyed Austrians first, then dealt with Russians, right, and then imposed the peace on both. Look at what happens in 1806, 1807, right? War of Fourth Coalitions. Prussians are defeated first, Russians are defeated next. Again, imposed peace. And so he was able to exploit the weakness of their opponents. He was masterful at this. And in my own work, I point out that he was oftentimes getting away. He was oftentimes putting his opponents in a position where war was the only option they had to deal with him, because at peace, he was absolutely brilliant. And that's one of the things we forget, that Napoleon as a diplomat is a very successful guy too. He negotiates Campo Formio, Luneville, Amiens, not to mention all the treaties later. And those are the treaties that are remarkably advantageous to France. And that's kind of, he always speaks about La France avant tout, the France above everyone else, everything else. And I think from the French point of view, that also is one of the reasons why they're willing to cut a slack to him. You probably followed the news kind of in France about the discussion they have been having about whether we should commemorate Napoleon with the especially bicentennials just finished right in 2000 recently, and then we had this movie we hopefully
Right.
will discuss.
Yeah.
So should we commemorate Napoleon, right? And some French historians argued that Napoleon is one of us. It's one of France. Modern France is Napoleon because of his legacy, and therefore we're willing to, or they are willing to, turn a blind eye to some of the problems he created. Not the least of them is, for example, restoration of slavery. Right? We can talk about all the reforms in Europe, but don't forget he's an archetypal colonialist, and the things that he did in Haiti or Saint Domingue, that's just absolutely stunning. So that's one. But what happens is that by 1812, 1813, his opponents, after a decade of losing to him, start to learn lessons, tangible lessons. And you see these fundamental changes that are introduced in Austria, in Prussia, in Russia, because they have to respond to his threat. And so by 1813, therefore, he's facing an opponent that is now willing to exploit his mistakes, his inability to maintain that high pace of military success. And so that's where his mistakes are now catching on to him. I do agree with you that the invasion of Spain is absolutely stunning mistake. We can rationalize it here and there, right? Some aspects of it, but I find it absolutely kind of silly. In hindsight, of course, that he did this, and of course, even bigger than that is the Russian invasion.
Right.
To me, that is absolutely the thing that that could have changed the destiny of Europe, but certainly his destiny.
Right. Napoleon was never really villainized by history. Actually, quite the opposite is true. He's more of a kind of a darling of a history, and according to the public rating, he stands second as one of the greatest individuals ever born during the whole history of humanity. He stands second after the Christ, after Jesus Christ, and before Prophet Muhammad. So if you ask me, that's quite of a place in history. So he was never really villainized, which is again very paradoxical because there is a lot there. Atrocities that he committed, his troops committed under his watch in Spain, execution of thousands of Ottoman, the Turkish prisoners of the war during his incursion in Palestine, abandonment of his own troops in Egypt. And the general is this, and as you mentioned, also these atrocities in the New World against rebellions in Haiti, and generally bleeding France dry of human resources. There are different estimates, but roughly about from 500,000 to 3 million French died during Napoleonic Wars, which pretty much sealed the fate of France as kind of a second-rate power for decades to come. So why Napoleon was never really villainized? What can explain that? You partially alluded to that he was a
Yeah,
master
well,
propagandist and he sculpted his own image.
yeah.
Is that it? Is that can
Um,
explain that?
I think again we have to go back and kind of differentiate between I think popular history and more academic history, because in
Okay.
popular history, sure, and I can name dozens of books that propagate kind of that Napoleonic legend and vision of Napoleon as this romantic liberal figure who tried all these good things. But in academic history, he's treated differently. So you can look up, for example, the work of historians of the Caribbean who've been very vocal about Napoleon's colonial policies, about what the French did in Haiti. You can look, let's say, to the works of again of Michael Broers, who before writing the 3 volumes on Napoleon's biography, he actually studied Napoleonic colonialism in Italy. or Jeffrey Ellis, who wrote about Napoleonic colonialism in parts of Rhineland, or Sam Mustafa, who wrote extensively on what Napoleon did in Westphalia, right, the kind of western part of Europe.
Yeah.
So there is an academic scholarship that is quite vibrant, and it's been going on for the past 30, 40 years that absolutely recast Napoleon's image. So I don't think the argument that he was never critically kind of dealt with or vilified, so to speak, is necessarily true. In fact, if anything, I mean, there are some scholars who go way beyond vilification and kind of drew these comparisons between Napoleon and Hitler, right, or Stalin. I'm not buying that, because Napoleon inherently is a very different historical figure, and those comparisons on me just don't hold any water there. But I think I think in my own books, and certainly in the lectures with students, what I call is kind of to bear in mind that history is always complex, that we should always always avoid simplicity in history. Human beings, I mean, just the people that surround us, you and me, we are complex beings. And so that same applies to our ancestors, right? To people who lived 200 or 500 years. So we should not expect them to be simplistic individuals who are guided by
Sure.
simple motivations. So,
Sure.
and if we accept the complexity of history, then it means that these historical figures cannot simply be all good or all bad, right? So
Sure.
there is a lot of kind of grayscale there in between. So Napoleon, yes, we need to maybe give Napoleon credit for the reforms in France, for transformations that he introduced that benefited long-term Europe, but also bear in mind that, yep, he's the guy who also made the decision to restore slavery. He's the one who creates a system that maintains a facade of a system that is essentially dictatorial. Um, but in your question, I think you assign blame to him that not necessarily I would not assign. So, for example, the decision to go to Egypt is not necessarily for him to make, because he's not in power. It's the government that makes a decision. He follows.
No, not to
Um,
go, to abandon the troops. Not
the
necessarily to go,
Mhm.
to
So to
abandon them.
abandon the troops,
Yeah.
yeah, we can certainly debate about whether that was um, a, a moral decision to make. But if you consider the historical context in which he makes the decision in August of 1799, when the news that he has is that of France imploding, France being on the verge of invasion, I think you can make a case for why he decided to return. And besides, he doesn't simply abandon the troops. He leaves the replacement, and he has all the intentions to get the troops back, and he does eventually bring them back, right, in 1801. So I think there's a lot to be said there, and same. I think we can. I think if we can follow this kind of willingness to understand the complexity of historical events, we can find a way to look at his decisions from multiple points. Same applies. I might disagree with the decision to go in Russia, and I certainly, in an alternative universe somewhere there in multiverse, probably is Napoleon who doesn't go into Russia. But can also kind of reading his reasoning for it, I can understand why he thought that this was a good
Sure.
decision.
Okay. You spoke partially about Napoleon's legacy on France, but what is Napoleon's legacy on the world and Europe in particular as this transformational figure between the end of the French Revolution and the beginning of the new era on the European continent?
The global context of Napoleonic Wars showed that Napoleonic Wars had equally, and in fact, I argue, a greater long-term impact overseas than in Europe. In Europe, we know that Napoleon's empire was defeated in 1815. Many of the changes, especially outside France, that he introduced were reversed. But his legacy is far more reaching overseas, right? This is where we can talk about absolutely remaking of the world, right? This is one of the German historians says transformation of the world, um, because the collapse of the Spanish Empire takes place during Napoleonic Empire or during Napoleonic Wars. The emergence of the independent Central America, South America, that's all part of this story. The British conquest of India is taking place right in the midst of it all. In fact, if you know, when you dig deep, you see how fretful British were about the French scare, that Napoleon will be able to get to India and use the local dissatisfaction of Indian ruling elites against the preponderance of the British power against them, right? So you see Wellington's brother, Richard Wellesley, is the Governor General of British East India Company, and he wields that tool. You know, that company is the club to beat down any anti-British sentiments on the continent. So that by the time we get to 1815, India is actually under British control. It is at this time, by 1815, the Dutch lost South Africa, Ceylon, West Indies. France's own colonial empire is largely dismantled. And of course, we shouldn't forget that it is at this time that United States truly becomes a continental power, right?
Yeah.
Louisiana
Yeah.
Purchase, the wars
Right.
against the British. To me, all of this are part of this wider legacy. And we cannot understand the importance of historical individual like Napoleon or the event like Napoleonic Wars if we only look at the one particular part of the world. This is a global phenomenon.
The legal system, the Napoleonic Code, and the social system, the advent of capitalism, would it happen without Napoleon in Europe? Did he contribute to that? Did he accelerate that? Or it was just the automatic process which would happen regardless of Napoleonic efforts?
It would have happened, I have no doubt about it, but Napoleon is the catalyst. I mean, he's the bull in the china shop, right? He
Yeah.
brings in, he comes in, he smashes, but also creates. And I think um, what my argument in all my writings is that Napoleonic system of government, or what I refer to as Napoleonic settlement, right, is crucial in creating modern Europe, and then you can see the impact of it in the rest of the world. And so, what are the elements of this of this Napoleonic system of government? Well, this is reorganizing local authorities into a centrally controlled bureaucratic government manned by professional bureaucrats and supported by the middle class. Another element is the creation of a new legal system, to which you alluded, that reflected revolutionary ideals of secularism, equality before the law, religious tolerance, reaffirmation of individuals' private property. This, again, we take all of this for granted. There are bits and pieces of it taking place in different parts of Europe, but Napoleon comes and creates a system. And there is a wonderful study by Rafe Blaufarb called the Great Demarcation, which talks about creation of modern sense, modern idea, modern legal system of property ownership right at this time. Right. Another important element is introduction of more efficient systems of governance, and that is especially important for tax collection and military recruitment. So Napoleon is a pioneer in this, as he is in establishing a police force to maintain control over population. That the police state that they're referring to, the close cultivation of public opinion. You would chuckle at this, but it's ubiquitous reference in both Napoleonic correspondence and the correspondence of other countries. The struggle against fake news, and they use this term, fake news, right? False news, they refer to it. So that was also kind of a very modern approach. Another important element is changing church-state relations. The power of the church was dramatically curtailed. Ecclesiastical estates, especially in Germany, were swept off the map. Vast areas of land that formerly belonged to the church were now secularized. And so the church moves in a very different direction because of this. And of course, the church lost in other ways too. For example, its authority in French controlled areas, certainly in France, is reduced by the introduction of freedom of religion, by civil marriages, by the legal recognition of right to divorce, by creation of secular education. Right, all these are fundamental to modern way of life. And Napoleon, if in many of the things that he does, he's a standardizer, and that especially is, not just laws or not just kind of military, but also things like weights and measurements, right?
Right.
Revolution creates the metric system, but Napoleon spreads it around. So taken as a whole, to me, this Napoleonic system, this Napoleonic settlement is a definitive challenge to the old way of life, and that transition, that kind of bridge that allows subsequent generation to build modern Europe. So it eradicates policies, it creates new ones, it expands the power of government, which would have happened, to answer your question, would have happened, but much slower, more long term. Napoleon kind of does smash and grab. By the time he's done, we are facing a new reality. And now you have to either accept it or do something about it.
Right. What do we learn from Napoleon? And by this, I don't mean personally from Napoleon, but from Napoleonic phenomenon, kind of from this entire Napoleonic saga in history. What can we learn from it?
Well, if nothing else, we'll learn the complexity of human experience, right? The complexity of human motivation. I mean, we can look at it from the political side of the great power struggles. We are entering essentially a new era of the great power politics, right? And there is a lot to be learned from looking at the late 18th and 19th century great power politics, and see how those great powers positioned themselves, how they dealt with each other. This is especially important during Napoleonic years, but also after Napoleonic years, right? In many respects, the kernels, the elements of modern system are set back in post-Napoleonic era with the Congress of Vienna, kind of the international security mechanisms, the Constitution of Europe, the conference systems that they all emerged. This is all part of what we are dealing with today. Another way to look at is kind of find why some governments are successful and others are not. Right? What makes Napoleon success story, and what factors make it a failure. I think that also is illustrative to how the governments deal with policies, how they deal with issues, how they deal with threats, both domestic and external. I think what Napoleonic era showed us is that military strength was inherently linked, right? So after Napoleonic era, it becomes absolutely clear that military strength is inherently linked to administrative excellence, right? How you manage things, financial prowess, right? Industrial capacity. I mean, if anything, it shows us, for example, that Britain, with a population that is, I think, 5 times less than Russian, can dominate the globe, right? Because not because that it has large army, but because it has an economy that allows it to do so. It has economy that sustains a naval power. So yes, Russia might have a largest continental force, but economically, it's nowhere near in the league of Britain or France or even other powers. So I think that's a lesson, and I think we're dealing with that with elements of it today, where we see some parts of the world who are economically quite vibrant and powerful, and they're wielding that power to dictate the course of engagement. Now, I think another way to look at this period, and that's the argument I'm making in towards the end of my book, is that to me this is the moment of this great divergence, right? And that's the term that's been used. It has been around for quite some time, but I use it to argue that Napoleonic Wars marks the point where Europe, from being one of the successful, prosperous, and powerful parts of the world, to becoming a global hegemon. Right? We know that China has had a good run. India has had a great run for quite some time. And yet, in the 19th century, their destinies change from being, the heavenly kingdom, from being the great Mughal empire, they become essentially the target of European colonialism.
Right.
And the legacy of that is, of course, with us. I mean, the century of humiliation is what shapes the Chinese, right, perception of the world. Their certainly sense of who they are and what the place of China is today. And that's the way I look at Chinese kind of resurgence in recent years, as a way of rebalance the world that was changed right after the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay. I have to ask you about this, the Ridley Scott's Napoleon. It's a new epic. I think no one can doubt that the Ridley Scott is one of the greatest the filmmakers of our age. Uh, what are your thoughts about it? How the first one is how historically accurate it is, and should the movies be historically accurate? And generally, what is your take at this movie from a cinematographic perspective?
Um, and let me ask, maybe answer from the and the last part first. No, the historic. I don't expect movies to be dissertations. I don't expect to have every I dotted and T crossed in them. We do expect, I think, certain level of historicity. We expect that the setting will be correct, that the big events will be correct, and of course, it goes without saying that the dialogue will be invented. The motivation may be kind of experimented with, but some things need to be true enough, right? Um, and of all the people, Ridley Scott should know better than that, but better than anyone, because what we consider as probably top three Napoleonic movies ever made belongs to him, right? His first film, The Duelist, is absolutely amazing,
Yeah.
both as a story, but also because of the details, attention to
Right.
historical details that he offers. And so, and so, in many respects, The Duelist is the kind of the opening of his career, and Napoleon is kind of the different opposite end of it, because having a budget of what $200 million and having the great actors and actresses, Scott managed to produce a remarkably weak movie. I wrote the review of it for one of the French periodicals, and the review started with the famous "mot de Waterloo" or "mot de Cambronne," merde, right? Because that's the impression I had when I left the movie. What the hell was this about? It's a series of vignettes that are loosely connected, kind of through the relationship Napoleon has with Josephine, but setting aside the historical accuracy, and there are dozens of them. I think some of my French colleagues counted over 90 of them. So, um, setting aside the historical inaccuracy, I think the movie doesn't work on the level of a story, right? And I think the bigger problem I have is that if we spend 3 hours in the company of that Ridley Scott's Napoleon, and then we witness Napoleon's return from Elba, right? The image we have in mind is of him being this fretful, insecure, petulant brat who can barely speak, always nervous, always bumbling. So if you're a soldier at that village of La Fray in March of 1815, and you have a choice to pull a trigger and shoot the bastard, or commit a treason and join him,
Right.
I would have no qualms about shooting Ridley Scott's Napoleon, but I know that the 5th Regiment, none of them acted on that. Instead, they switched sides and joined him. So why? Right? And I think that's the missing element, is that Napoleon that we see in the movie is nowhere near the reality of who Napoleon was, this complex figure. I think Scott makes no attempt whatsoever to offer this analysis of who Napoleon was: a tyrant, a visionary. I think Lord Clarendon, and I often cite this, Lord Clarendon has a wonderful quote about Cromwell when he says Cromwell was the great bad man. Is Napoleon a great bad man? And there's a lot to be said about it. So what's his legacy? Right? In the movie, we see nothing of his legacy. The battles are ridiculous. They are essentially imaginations of Scott that had no connection to historical truth. But I would have gone with that if the idea or the sense of Napoleon was correct.
Okay. And this is my last question. Napoleon is arguably one of the most studied, if not the most studied, historic figures in the world, to the point that we actually know what he had for breakfast before this battle was that battle, right? It's
Yes.
it's it's that detailed, I would say. Where does the Napoleonic study stand right now, and where it's headed?
Well, you're absolutely right. Napoleon is probably the most studied historical individual, and certainly most written about. There is an estimate of well over 500,000 books devoted to him, to his kind of the era that he's active, more than any historical personality. So, uh, and yet you would be surprised to hear that there's still a lot to be said about this period. One part kind of of this is that we need to reevaluate, reassess a lot of what we have written before. Remember, history is a continual reassessment. So, and that's one of the things I tell students, that history is not simply set in stone. You know, somebody chiseled it and it's right there. Every generation, right, requires a reassessment. We for example, we have moved away, right, from dealing with Napoleon as this liberal figure that he was in the 19th century to a more kind of critical assessment of the 20th century, and now a far more critical assessment in the start of the 21st century. So it's an ongoing process. We need to reassess his system. We need to assess his colonial policies. So that's one. But there is a lot of gaps in between. For example, I challenge you, listeners, to find a solid study of Napoleon's ministers. Right? I mean, you would be stunned, right? Wait a second. We don't have? No. We have a study, for example, by Isaac Wallach of Napoleon's collaborators, which is a brilliant work on key individuals around Napoleon. But we don't have a systematic study on who were the people, and there were 32 ministers that he had, who were there, the cohort that made the empire possible, the man that managed the empire, right? We don't have a good study of that. We still don't have a good study of financial system of Napoleonic Empire. For example, that's my next project, and kind of big project, and to see the emergence of the what it's later they term military industrial complex, but I will refer to it as military financial complex that it had the state working closely with banks, working closely with these numerous private interests in order to make wars, kind of sustain the wars. So that's is an exciting area of study. And of course, there's a lot to be said about culture, a lot to be said about society, the role of women, the kind of what how the women were treated or not. For example, you were referring to that the Napoleon was perceived to be as a vulgar. The people who perceived him as a vulgar were intelligentsia, right? They were intellectuals, people like Germain de Stael, Benjamin Constant, Chateaubriand, who could not get beyond the fact that Napoleon spoke with this heavy accent, and so they constantly referred to him as the foreigner, right? Well, we need a new assessment of what was the role of that intelligentsia during the empire. So there is a lot to be said, a lot to be written. If among your listeners are young students who want to get involved, um, absolutely. I've go to France every year to do work in the archive, and I think I would not exaggerate if I say there are mountains of unopened, unconsulted work. Just one more thing. One of my friends went to French military archives, and he wanted to study, for example, French vivandières. So these are the French women who were with the army, effectively supplying soldiers with food and drink. And so he went to the archives, and he found that the cartons, these boxes that contain this information, have not been opened since the end of the war. So you had a tingling sensation with the first one to really go through that stuff.
Oh, wow. All right. I think we can respectfully stop it here. Thank you very much, Dr.
Thank you so much,
Mikaberidze, for a very interesting conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and please do not forget to hit the subscribe button down below, and I'll see you on the next episode.
Thank
Bye.
you.